Hey everyone, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Unleash the Service Dog Gals. You're here with Megan and Bridget, and today we are going to be diving into service dogs and what they actually do for trauma. Now, before we get into it, if you can all take a minute, and it really helps us if you can subscribe and like this. It helps for us to create more content, and also you guys can be notified of when we're releasing another episode. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bridget. So, what service dogs do for trauma?
Yeah, I think that the important thing to ground this conversation is that when people hear service dogs for trauma, the conversation can get really romanticized really fast. And I think that's kind of true with all service dogs. We tend to think that, oh, a service dog's going to come into my life and they're just going to fix everything.
Which we know is not true. Function versus the fantasy of it all.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So I do want to say very clearly that I think you probably agree with me on this, Meg, that these dogs can be profoundly helpful. Absolutely. They do a ton of help and work for us. They're not magic fixes.
They're not taking away what you went through or what you're experiencing, but they are helping you manage those daily symptoms to make
Yes.
functioning in your life a little bit easier.
Yeah. And like trauma is not going to disappear once a dog enters a picture.
Right.
It's not going to cure. Dogs are not going to cure things. But like you said, a trained dog is definitely going to help a person live with the trauma. So once we kind of move past this like miracle idea of these little miracle workers, for me, the question becomes, what can these dogs actually do? And I think, for one of the clearest ways I've been able to understand this type of work is that they're trained to help with very real daily problems.
Yes.
But these problems are tied to trauma. So we have to think about things like distress. When somebody is in distress from their past trauma, hypervigilance, right? You've probably seen that. Disorientation, panic in public, difficulty functioning in public, but also at home. You think night terrors.
Yeah.
So they do have a lot of power, but these kinds of tasks these are the kinds of tasks that are going to be commonly discussed in the literature. So where I'm drawing on this from isn't, what I want the dog to do, right? Because that's a different conversation than what the dog can actually do.
Yeah. And when you talk about tasks and these psychological symptoms or physical symptoms that stem from trauma, whether it's night terrors, disassociation, feeling anxious, unsettled, and then there's these specific tasks, that's where the service dog comes into play and why service dogs are very different than, an emotional support dog because they are task oriented. I think it's helpful for the listeners to define what is a service dog? What are they doing that's different in function from an emotional support dog?
Yeah, I think that's a good conversation. I mean, when I think of working animals, I think of it as a broad umbrella, right? Working animals are holding up that umbrella. And then within that, we have therapy dogs, we have emotional support dogs, we have our service dogs, and they all perform different purposes.
And so a service dog is supporting an individual with a disability. So
And
they're task trained for those specific interruptions and those specific needs of the individual.
yeah, like interrupting anxiety attacks, right? With little boops on your leg or a paw, right?
Or a lick on your face. Yeah.
Yeah. Or things like calming during escalation
And that can look like physical pressure.
yes.
Yeah. There's tasks where there can be that physical pressure. And with that physical pressure, it can help slow down the heart rate, reduce the blood pressure, and just really help reground. Because a lot of times when these triggers are happening, it's internal. So it brings that focus externally, which when that happens, it's helping to reground and recenter and just connect back with the present instead of going back into that trauma or that trigger that you're experiencing.
Right.
Yeah. So internal versus external. And that's what these dogs are helping do and interrupt with those specific tasks.
Yeah, that refocus into this
The
moment.
present. Yeah.
I like that. That's a
Yeah.
really good way to explain it. I also think that like one thing that I find fascinating that they can do is helping someone exit an overwhelming environment, right? Like find the exit, get me out of this situation. We kind of talked about it last week where if you're out in public and a flashback happens or something happens and you just need to leave your environment, dogs can help you do that,
Mhm.
which is kind of cool.
They can also help with physical space. So
Yeah.
there's tasks around blocking. And so they're able to set their body physically in front of you through this specific task that they've been trained to do that can help create just a little bit of space, if you're
Yeah.
feeling overwhelmed in a very crowded area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was one that I found interesting in the literature
Mm.
because it's kind of a controversial task. Because when you think like some people are saying that that's enabling, right?
How so?
That's how the it just said that it's enabling rather than pushing the person further into recovery. But that begs the question that we started at the beginning, right? What can they do and what can't they do? They're not a cure.
They're not a cure. Let's think in a grocery store. Let's think you're at the checkout line and someone's a bit close. I mean, I think people in general are feeling like, oh, okay, you're a bit in my space.
Yeah.
And so someone that might be experiencing PTSD or some of those symptoms wants to create a physical barrier. You can have that dog put into the position. It's creating a little space. It's not enabling, it's a
Right.
protection. And it's why there is a service dog is to help mitigate that. So
Yeah.
they're not doing something that's inherent in their role
Right.
is to help manage some of those symptoms. It's not enabling.
I'm with you on
I would
this.
disagree on that. I would have to understand a bit more what fully that context of that criticism is. But from when I train service dogs and from what I see, and also from what I understand of trauma, is having tools is very helpful when you're coping and working through it. And that
Yes.
would be a tool to create a little bit of physical distance. It's not a lot,
But I
but
mean,
it's something
I
just
would
to
like
help.
it.
I know. When someone's a little too close at the Timmies,
Yeah,
right? Like,
but
yeah.
I think that like, what service dogs for trauma actually do to me, if I wanted to define it broadly, I would say it's a disability mitigating work that helps someone function and move through the world
And feel safe.
with steadiness, with
Yeah.
safety,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
With comfort. And I think that's a really beautiful thing. But to me, like why can that matter so much for trauma in the first place? Why does the work that these dogs are doing matter so much? And to research has repeatedly pointed to the idea that service dogs might not only just offer us support with tasks, but they support recovery, not only through those tasks, but through connection. Right. So think about recovery in places like the home, community life, health, right? Like those sorts of things, because we know that trauma shrinks a person's world
Sure.
and a dog can help expand it again. So when we think, I think a little more abstractly about what dogs can do, they don't just do tasks for us. There's not
They're
this
not
list.
just doing tasks. You're right. And I agree with you. So they're creating structure, they're creating connection. And maybe you don't feel comfortable to connect with humans because maybe the human hurt you and we're the source of that trauma. So to have a dog and a companion and something, an animal that you feel safe with, I don't want to say something, having an animal that you feel safe with and you have that connection, unconditional love, you guys are not going to hurt each other. It's a safe place. Having a dog, you also have to have a routine. So uh, it can sometimes when there is a traumatic experience or you're suffering from PTSD, you want to withdraw and stay in the home. And that cycle, it's very harmful just to stay there and sit with your trauma. But what these dogs also do is they have to go pee. They have to be stimulated. The training has to continue. So it helps establish a routine, getting you out. We know when you get out and you can be exposed to sun and to nature, that is a natural healer. And so just to get that routine, get out of the home, be with a dog, be with something that is safe, it can really help change the chemical response in your
Yeah.
brain of all those negative things and all those traumatic things that you will still hold, but you're balancing it with something else.
Yeah, I mean, if I would recommend for the listeners to check out Dr. Colleen Dell. You can just Google her name. She has a website, but she's one of the leading researchers on service dogs PTSD. And most of the research has been on veterans because of, that gap that we talked about last week. But she has a research study on suicide. And she's pointed to service dogs matter partly because they reduce that loneliness piece. That hopelessness, and they increase social support for people struggling, like you kind of talked about there, which is cool. It improves emotional attention regulation in these ideas, and it gives a I think this is important to talk about that more social aspect because it moves us into a conversation of why they help, not just how they help,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, naturally, you're going to have more social interactions when you have a dog. And it can be around the dog and it can be very easy and lighthearted conversations.
Yeah. But that moves us into this idea that we have to talk about the world itself. Because if we're talking about public access dogs and they're getting us out and they're helping and they're doing that sort of stuff, a service dog can make public life definitely more possible. But public access also brings visibility, questions, assumptions, right? If you don't want to be approached by people, but you're bringing a dog into a place dogs don't normally go, it is going to kind of change public access to you because it's not neutral.
Yeah.
You're dealing with the public.
And public perception. Yeah. And trying to maybe get more information than they should have access to, right? Why do you have this dog? What is this dog needed for? Well, if it has, that vest and it's behaving properly in public, you don't have to ask those questions because it can be very intrusive. Of course, there's curiosity. Of course, it's a cute dog, but just understanding the dog is a way for these people to get out and again feel
Mhm.
safe in public, and it's maybe their only way to get
Yeah.
out. It doesn't mean it's the only tool that they're using to in their recovery process, but it is one of them and can be a
Yeah.
significant one.
It really can because I think like the conversation around public access really highlights that public access is work itself.
And the dog is working.
Yeah.
Because if let's I'm just gonna keep going to the grocery store. Why not? But because it can be crowded, any crowded place. And the dog is trained, those specific tasks are trained, and they can pick up on it. They're working the whole time. So someone else may perceive and they look, oh, there's a dog in a vest. Does it really need to be here? But maybe that person is starting to have a disassociation and that dog is highly trained, they should be, to pick up on that. And they can interrupt it before it escalates to a full disassociation. And they can give a quick little nudge or a quick little lick or something just again to bring them from that internal struggle. Externally, it's like, oh, yeah, okay, let me just pay for this. And then I can move out.
Mhm. But that's where so much work around public access has to happen because if we want a dog to be able to interrupt these moments, they first need to have strong obedience.
Mhm.
Stronger obedience than most, right?
Right. Which is where they're differing in
And
these emotional support animals.
right.
It's a huge difference.
It's huge different, but they need appropriate manners. And I think this is the piece that we don't talk often enough, but they need an incredible amount of engagement and focus, right? Because there's so much happening around the dog in that world, but they have to tune into their person. And that itself is a lot of work.
It's a lot of work, it's a lot of exposure to distractions and the dog not going to those distractions, still staying in tune to the person they're supporting,
Mhm.
which is where these rigorous training programs come in, and that's why it takes a dog approximately 2 years when trained by a full-fledged agency,
Yes.
as opposed to a civilian-based program. That might take a little bit longer because there's that guidance, but then also the owner is a part of that training. So
Yeah.
it's yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and to my students listening, you'll probably recall I've said this in so many classes, but you can't have a service dog walking through the deli department, the meat department, with their nose up in the air, interested in the steak, right? Because if they're interested over in those areas, they're not picking up on what their job is supposed to do, right?
Mhm.
So there needs to be an incredible amount of work laid before we even accept them into public.
Yeah.
Right? There's a certain standard. And like I said, public access is work itself. And we can't miss those tasks that are so important to train.
Yeah.
I do think that, yeah, the public can also push back. We know some Canadian public perception studies have found that the general public is overall quite supportive of service dogs. Most people look and say, "Yeah, that's great. I really love them." Um, but at the same point in time, the same line of research has also found that veterans with PTSD report stress over negative public interactions because the dog draws just like it draws in attention. So when
Did it speak to what those specific interactions could look like? Is it people questioning them?
yes, yeah,
Yeah. And that can feel very, I think when people are questioned
it's
in
intrusive.
general, it's intrusive. It can, be a bit uncomfortable. And when it's around your disability, yeah, that can be really tough.
Yeah, but like it's even though we have support for service dogs broadly, it's not going to erase the reality that people face. There's going to be staring because people can't help but look at a cute dog. And there's going to be questions. Hey, why do you have a dog? Which
Yeah.
is again intrusive. There can be access issues.
Yes.
Um, and definitely I've experienced it with dogs I've trained in public, people distracting the dog. That's part of training for public access work. People are going to make kissy noises and there's the whole conversation about whether I give my dog's name out because then people might try to distract them. So even though there is that support, it's preparing for public access is a big part of what they do. We have to prepare them to handle the realities of public access. But I think we have to ask the ethical question because we're talking so much about what the dog does for the human. But I think we have to ask, what is this work asking of the dog?
Yeah. It's, yeah, it does come into ethics. Does this animal want okay, let me think how I'm gonna phrase this. Because, well, the reason I have hesitation is we are always shaping the dog. Inherently, if they could do whatever they wanna do, they would probably do whatever they wanna do. Within that, can we use positive reinforcement? Okay, you really love food. Hello, lab. Or you really love toys. Let's use that reward based system so that we can have a relationship where you're able to do those tasks. They also love to be stimulated and have tasks to do, but making sure it's appropriate. Specific example I can give is I once had a dog. I honestly can't even remember if it was for PTSD or autism. I can't remember, but this dog loved to swim. And the dog is not supposed to swim because if you're walking by water, they get distracted, they go run in, they pull you. That was one of the standards back in the day. I'm not sure what it is at this point. But this dog, more than any dog I had ever met, all he wanted to do was be in water. And I'm like, this is unethical for me. This dog wants to swim. I don't want to take this away from this dog just so he can work. Like that was his any body of water. He's like, let me in. I remember I was in my mom's backyard and there's like this disgusting pond. He's like, yes, this is for me. Pond, pool, puddle of water. I'm like, I can't. Ethically, I cannot. So I think also understanding that there should be it should be mutually beneficial as well for the dog, making sure it's reward based, making sure that this is something they want to do. If you're trying to shape a dog that really doesn't want to do this, that's not the dog for you, which is why there's such a high percentage of washouts, they call them, where, they have gone through all these professional standards and training and everything and exposures, but they're just not the right fit. And that's okay. And that's to be expected. And I think we have to honor that as well.
Yeah, because we want the dog to be a partner,
Yes.
right? The goal is to have them be a partner. And in order to do that, the dog's welfare has to be central.
Mhm.
Because if that dog is not having their needs met, right? How well are they going to be as a worker and as a partner?
Because then there's always that opposition. You're always trying to pull this dog into something they are just not
Hmm.
equipped to do. Maybe they're a well-natured dog, but they're not meant to do this. They have to have that specific drive and that specific interest to what you're doing.
And that's the reality of it because so many of these organizations consider the animal's welfare. That's why we have washouts.
Yeah.
Not only why, there's many reasons, as you know, but
And the washouts, it's not like they're a lost cause. They just
no.
might be meant for something different. If there's a dog that has a really high drive and it's like, okay, you're a bit off the handle. Maybe you're a great detection dog, or
Mhm.
hey, you're such a lovely dog, but you're not meant to be a service dog. Can be a wonderful companion dog. And companion dogs are more emotional support. They don't have public access rights, but
Mhm.
they're still just a well-balanced dog. They're just not meant for that. And that's okay.
What we're talking about here, right, is we need to kind of raise concerns. So we've talked about the idea that, these are the type of specific tasks that are in the literature that are kind of our standard tasks for this type of work. We talked about public access being part of that work. But when we position these dogs as workers, this is going to raise these concerns we're talking about the lack of standardization outside of these organizations.
Hmm.
Insufficient downtime. Workers need rest, and so does a dog.
I think that's a public perception as well. People, and some of our listeners may find this, is that when you look at a service dog, and it comes from love. It comes from a love of animals. It's like, well, wait a minute, does that dog ever get to rest? And yes, if it comes from a reputable organization, has high ethical standards for these animals, they're going to make sure that that wellness and that rest and that time off is there and is communicated. So I want to assure, being part of service dog organizations, at least the ones I was a part of, that is a priority. The dog's welfare is a priority too, and they're not working all the time. They have their, goofy time off and all these things. It's not 24 hours. It shouldn't be 24 hours because they need to rest.
Yeah.
And also these tasks are games for these dogs. It's not a discipline. So, and when we say that the training has to be ongoing, you're playing games with them. And that's why we're talking about reward based. So if there's a dog that has this favorite toy, waking up from a night terror, to someone who isn't aware of it, they could think, oh, this dog has to be on alert. Well, we might put a tug of war thing to a blanket. They're playing tug of war. Or when they're interrupting, they get a reward after that. It's not just we're putting them to these, working conditions. It's so serious. You don't get to play. This is play for them. This is engagement and
That's
stimulation.
and that's why you want the dog to enjoy the work,
Right.
right? And that's
Yes.
why, force-free methods are, the standards that organizations are being held to. Like we're not forcing these dogs to work. It's not going to be enjoyable for anyone. It's not going to be reliable.
Right. And Assisted Dogs International has really laid the standards for
Yeah.
that, making sure that it is positive methods used to train these dogs. And if it's not a good fit, then they're washed out.
Yeah.
And I think
And
that's needed.
I don't know if you know this, but is it I seem to recall that Assistance Dog International recently removed punishment, or they had like a date set saying you have to remove certain forms of punishment by a certain date.
When I worked for an Assisted Dogs International organization, I actually worked for two. Back then, it would be you would give a command. If the dog didn't do the command, then you could give a verbal correction. If they didn't
Mm,
respond to that verbal correction, then you could give a tug. And now it shifted, and that was almost 10 years ago. So I actually think it's been quite a bit of time from
mhm.
my understanding. You weren't in the kennels, you weren't allowed to use there were no prong collars. It was flat leash collar. What are the why can I
E-collars?
e-collars? Yeah, those were not allowed. So when it was getting rid of the forceful methods, that would be as simple as like a quick tug. And then it's shifted to you have to redirect them from a
Mhm.
different way. So I can't speak to all the organizations that are affiliated with Assisted Dogs International, but 10 years ago, that was already something that was implemented.
Mhm.
Yeah. when I was on my way out
Right.
of doing it because I had a baby, not because they were a bad organization. But back then they were already phasing all that out.
Yeah. So, I mean, it all comes down to making sure the work is enjoyable
Mhm.
and compatible with a for the dog to have a good life. That's the ethical standards we need to hold ourselves to when we're working with these dogs. And I always like to say that why does it matter to bring the dog up in this conversation? Because if the dog's not enjoying the work, that puts you at risk.
It does. And when we talk about what dogs do for trauma, service dogs do for trauma, and we talk about the dog's welfare, that's why when there are the civilian based programs, or even not even civilian based programs, for specifically for PTSD service dogs, they make sure there's different modalities, different methods for getting that individual support. They have to have a care team that they're seeing. The dog is not the only answer, and that is for the dog's welfare. Because if you're going at it and the dog is your only tool to deal with the trauma, what does that do for the dog? We have to have their well-being in mind. And that's what these agencies are doing. And that's what other ones should be doing because
Absolutely.
it can't be the only thing. There have to be multiple things you're doing to work through the trauma with a care team. It can be so many different things. It could be therapy. It could be through medication. It could be through, there's trauma yoga. Like that's not the only thing. Okay.
Yeah.
But there's different things that they should be doing. It shouldn't be, I just have a service dog to work through these severe symptoms that I'm experiencing.
Because that circles us right back to the beginning when we
Mhm.
started talking about what they actually do. Well, they're not a cure. They're
No,
they're just
they're a
one
tool.
piece
Yeah.
to a recovery process, right? Or like
I don't even want to say tool when I say that. They're a
yeah,
companion. Yeah, they're not
yes.
a tool. They're not an inanimate object. Yeah, no, they're a living being that can feel and all these things. So they're a companion. They're a support
Yeah.
companion. Yeah.
And at the end of the day, like I think, a good place to kind of move us to is you have to question whether the dog's personality is right for the work.
Yeah.
Right? I love some of the organizations who have multiple programs because if a dog's personality doesn't fit for this type of work, well, we can pop them and try them over on this type of work.
And that's how the organizations, the ones that I worked for,
Yeah.
functioned, is you would train them generally to have public access standards, to be desensitized to all these different distractions. And then once they're in advanced training, it's called. So when they're like 16 months, 14, 16,
When their
18 months, when
personalities
they're a bit more mature,
when
yeah,
their personalities
then
have come through.
yes. And then you can figure out what is the best fit. And
Mhm.
again, even within that, sometimes you think and it's like, well, no, this dog is not going to work out. And that's okay. You can be a companion dog.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
that's I love that they do that because I think it's such an ethical starting point,
it is.
right? We prepare them for the realities of public access, which is work itself, and then we match them there to the type of work they will be best at.
Mhm.
But that begs the question, what type of dog is good for this type of work?
That's a really great question. In service dog agencies, there's typically the lab, of course, and then Bernese Mountain Dog because they're big stature. So a lot of times there's crossbreeding with them. But you're not having to go against some of those natural instincts the dogs have where there's protection or where there's guarding or where there's like a herding dog or something, you're the you're not going against breed instincts when you have a lab, which can be helpful. And
Mhm.
with owner trained, yeah, you might be trying to manage some of those things when they're in these public access settings. So, yes, there's breed discrimination, but there also is,
Mhm.
these instinctual behaviors that some other dog breeds may not be a good fit to be a service dog for those reasons. Or maybe they are in the home, they can help out, but maybe not in public. It might be more of a challenge
Right.
because you can only shape so much. Again, we want to make sure it's mutually beneficial for that dog as well.
Yeah. When I think of, you know, when I think of like, say, hearing dogs, for example, like you don't want a Eeyore type hearing dog who's going to fall asleep during sounds.
Mhm.
Right. And if you have a vision dog, you again don't want an Eeyore dog who's going to be super lazy because there's a lot of depending activity that we need to do in that role.
But maybe
Right.
those dogs are facility dogs
Yeah.
because there's a lot of sleeping involved and cuddles and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, like, matching that personality, like, even outside of breed. I don't know about you, but when I was in the organizations, I used to before I even got in, I used to think a lab is a lab is a lab. No, that's not true.
No, they have different there's low energy, medium, high, and then what
Yeah.
yeah, what you're responding to.
Yeah, and then you have to kind of pair them with the type of work based on their individual preferences outside of breed standards.
Mhm.
So, I mean, for me, I think we have to be careful with this. You need a very specific personality for this type of work,
Yeah.
right? Like, you don't want an overly sensitive dog because if you're dealing with, anxiety and maybe night terrors where you're lashing out, we need a dog who's not going to be super sensitive to that.
Right.
So ethically, it goes back to matching the type of work with the personality of the individual dog,
Mhm.
which goes back to washouts.
Yeah.
Because in the owner trainer world, right?
That's tough. You put all your money, you put all your time, and then there is because of that, there's more pressure for this dog to work out, but it might not be a reflection of you. It's just not for this dog. And that's tough because you've put in so much, which going back to our previous episode is why we need those other options for civilians that are being left out of these conversations and these organizations so that if there is a washout, that's okay. And we don't have to force a dog to do something that they're not meant to do.
Yeah. I mean, whether or not we want to look at this from whichever perspective, like if we want to look at this as the human or the animal or both would be my
Yeah,
preference.
both would be my preference. Me too.
But I think it's important to just make sure that we have the right dog for the right work, but we pull that pressure off the people by building up some support systems.
Mhm. Do you have any thoughts on specific dogs for service dog work?
I think that like part my favorite thing to do is candidate screening because there's a lot I can tell in candidate screening. And my students listening who have been through our candidate screening with Unleash Niagara, we don't look for obedience.
Mm.
We look for temperament because we have to make sure that the dog is suited. So candidate screening tells us so much about what we're asking of them. And I think that if we put some of those stigmatized breeds in PTSD work, access challenges can happen. So it's a good conversation for people wanting these types of dogs to sit down with a professional trainer and work through these because you can put all your money into a Rottweiler and try to get into a store and you might get denied and that could cause some problems internally. Problems is probably not the best word, but hopefully you understand what I mean. So I think it's very important that people kind of connect in with a professional trainer to assess breed, but also individual personality work. Because every, every person, regardless of PTSD, whether you're a veteran, you're an emergency service, or you're a victim of crime, what we're going to ask of the dog is going to be different.
Yeah.
Right? So generalizing out, this is the type of dog that you want for it. We could probably do that, but I just think that would get
For
us.
organization wise, but when you're going for civilian, yeah, if you're a victim of crime, if you've experienced a trauma, yeah,
If we want to kind of have those more individual conversations in
right.
that regard. I loved how the organizations did it. And I'm sure the ones I was with operate similarly to you, but they would, you know, train a dog kind of generally, but then find the person for the dog.
Mhm. Yeah,
Right?
and what
Rather than the other
happens
way around.
what happens is where they're connected and paired up with, someone or an agency, and the connection is not there. And that's where organizations it's nice because you can switch it out, but
Yes.
again, the individual, it's like there can be the risk of it being more forceful to shape something that isn't working.
Yeah, it's a much higher risk at
Much
that,
higher
right?
risk.
Because
Yeah.
people invest time and money. And when we talked last week, there is a limited time and money when we're talking about this. So of course there's this, it's not people are, trying to be mean,
Mhm.
right? They're
It's like, "Oh, I just want this to
to work.
work."
They're
Yeah.
desperate
Yeah, they're
because the
desperate.
systems aren't there to support them, which is why we want to have these
Yeah, there's
conversations.
structural, systematic problems, yeah, that are leaving
Yeah, that are
folks
leaving
out.
out, but
Mhm.
that's also putting people at risk, the public at risk, because if the public access work isn't done to standards, we're putting the public at risk because what if a child touches the dog and the dog is reactive?
Right, or the dark dog startles, and
Right.
service dogs are trained, uh, go through intensive training for such a long time to make sure they aren't startled,
Mhm.
and if they are startled, they react appropriately. There's not any risk in
Yes.
that.
We eliminate the risk. So it
And
isn't
if there is with an owner trained, that's a problem.
it is.
And not only is it at risk to the public, it's at risk to the individual. And it puts a stigma on service dogs. And if there is an appropriately trained service dog out there working, and then there's a dog that's in there that has no business being in there, it's not trained to standard, and it is a risk or it is reactive or whatever it might be, that puts the person with the legitimate service dog at risk.
Right.
Because what if that dog defends itself because there's been, a reaction or the dog's barking or lunging or, the dog that is not supposed to be in public, which is why we are going to talk about this more in depth on another episode. But the safety and the consideration has to be there for the person that has that disability with the dog, but also the dog needs to be safe as well.
Right, because and I mean, it would be devastating for whether an organizationally trained or an owner trained dog or a bad interaction to happen in the public. And then guess what? The dog it now has to career change because it can't handle work anymore.
And what does that do for trauma?
Right. Yeah. So the standards are so important to protect the public, to protect the individuals with disabilities, to protect the broader disability, right? But also to protect the dog. This isn't just a one prong approach. We have to address, I think, all of this for all parties involved.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for me, when people ask me the question, well, what do service dogs really do for trauma? To me, that's not the question we should be asking. To me, the question is how do we talk about how service dogs can help responsibly? Join us for our next episode where Megan is going to talk about court and facility dogs. Unleashed,
The service dog gals.
trauma,
Trauma, disability,
and who gets left out.